Welcome to My Morning Cup, a podcast produced by Costa Media Advisors and brought to you by the generous support of the Tennessee Valley Authority. To learn more about TVA's impact on our community, follow TVA on Instagram at TVA and on Twitter X at TVA News. My Morning Cup, where we have interesting conversations with genuine people. I'm Mike Costa, your host. My guest this week is Tom Henderson. Tom is a longtime broadcast journalist and most recently the former news director at WTVC News Channel 9. Now retired, Tom is a gentleman farmer. Tom, welcome to My Morning Cup. Before we get into a long, passionate discussion about the state of broadcast journalism, let me ask, what's in your morning cup?
Well, I am a simple guy, and so my morning cup has Folgers 40 weight, black, no sugar. That's how I drink it. 40
weight as in 40 weight oil?
That's right. Thick and chewy and just a big old cup of morning coffee to get me going.
Does the spoon stand up in it?
Will. If I balance it just right, it's like it's syrup or something.
How many you do?
I do one big cup, and on a tough day, I may go back and have another cup, around midday. But I don't drink anything coffee-wise after 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
Now, what defines a tough day for a retired gentleman farmer?
Well, if the tomatoes aren't bearing.
Oh, well, and we all know how painful that can be.
Oh, that can wreck your whole afternoon. No, it's I really do have it pretty easy these days compared to when you and I worked together. And
I hear you had a stressful boss, but
Yeah, we worked things out. It was not too bad.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
We worked a long time together. I've always been interested in your career, and I think you have a lot to, your career has a lot of lessons to offer folks. And that's what I want to talk about, kind of how you started, how you got to where you are, and some of the things you learned along the way. So you grew up in North Georgia, right?
I did. I grew up in Cobb County, which most of your folks, probably your listeners, will probably be familiar with, in the Ackworth and Kennesaw area.
Yeah.
Went to high school there, and after graduating, I kind of drifted a little bit and did several things, none of which amounted to anything. And
like what?
Well, thought about going into business with my dad, but he really wasn't too excited about that, it turned out. And so I took some heating and air conditioning classes at the Votech.
Oh, wow. I didn't
Marietta Votech for a little less than a year. And then I worked full time in a textile mill. Ackworth is a textile town.
This is after high school?
It's after high school. And really didn't see that as anything that I could build a future on. And got the opportunity to go to the University of Georgia.
Yeah.
And jumped on that. And it really felt like the right decision at the right time. And so I went over to Athens and finished up my degree there. And
where did you get bit by the journalism bug?
It was while I was at school. I knew that
in college. So in high school, you weren't remotely interested.
No, I knew that my strengths were with language and with humanities. Nothing technical, chemistry, physics, all that stuff was pretty much off the table for me.
As for most journalists.
Yes, that's right. And so I went to Georgia in the mass media program. And came out with mass media with an emphasis on broadcast news.
Okay.
Came out in the middle of a recession in 1982. And all the talk was, you're not going to get a job. It's terrible out there. It'll take forever. And very fortunate to have gotten an offer from the radio station in Lafayette, Georgia. A gentleman named Rich Gwynn, whose family owned the station, made me an offer, and I took that offer, and that's how I ended up in this region. Stayed in Lafayette for almost a year, covered some really big stories in that brief amount of time. The first one was the ambush that was sprung on a small plane carrying Medellin cartel cocaine.
Is that illegal?
That was very illegal. Yes, it landed in the middle of the night at the Little Lafayette Airport, and the pilot and co-pilot didn't realize that the FBI and the GBI were waiting on them, and they sprung the trap, and some shots were exchanged, and they got him in custody. And I came into work that morning and started my rounds and called the Lafayette Police Department like I always did. And the nice lady on the other end of the line said, "Yeah, you probably want to ride out to the airport. I can't talk about it, but everybody's out there." There were law enforcement everywhere. There was a mound of duffel bags, military-style duffel bags filled with what we were told at the time was uncut cocaine. And I think I probably will get this detail wrong, but I think it was in the neighborhood of 400 pounds.
Wow.
And this was in a day when cocaine was raging across the United States. It was the disco era, and all that sort of stuff that you've seen in movies and on television shows was sort of in the pop culture. And it turned out that it was, in fact, a load of cocaine. The cartels had discovered that coming in on the coast, those doors had been slammed shut by the Coast Guard and others. And so now they were flying inland a few hours. Yeah. And that's how they ended up at the Lafayette airport.
You know, what's interesting about a story like that is, a lot of people say, oh, small town Lafayette radio reporter. This is a national story, and national stories don't just happen in Los Angeles or New York. They tend to happen in the Lafayettes.
Well, that's right. And there's a pretty strong bias in the national media toward the two coasts. Things that happen on the East Coast and on the West Coast get a lot more attention than things that happen in the heartland. And so some of these stories, if this bust had been made in New York City, it would have just exploded, and there would have been weeks and weeks of follow-up. And that
they'd be reporting live from the landing strip.
That's right. In a case like this, the networks often will rely on their local partners to dish them the information and the audio from interviews and video if it's television and that kind of thing. They won't send anybody to the scene unless they calculate that the story is going to develop over the course of days or weeks, and then maybe they'll send the crew in. So you can Google that, by the way, if you're interested in knowing more. You just Google Lafayette cocaine 1982 Medellin, and you can read the some of the court followings in Atlanta and U.S. District Court and some of those kinds of things. Pretty interesting.
And I got to go back to you going to University of Georgia. Most of the folks I've spoken to, and probably most the broadcast journalists you've known over your career, because you've known quite a few, you spent your whole career in it, get bit by that bug at a young age. At least high school, they're working for the school paper and things like that. But that didn't happen for you.
No, I think what you're describing is more true today than it was when I was there. Journalism programs at these big schools are very popular. And so they've built them out. But in 1980, which was my first year at Georgia, not so much. Internships were not even required. And now you don't come out of J school without at least one internship, and a couple or three if you're really aggressive. And so I took a volunteer position at WUOG, which was the student radio station there, and sort of fell in love with the idea of radio. It's a great training ground in the early part of, or was for me a great training ground in the early part of my career, because you write copy over and over and over again. When I came from Lafayette to Chattanooga, I went to work at WGOW AM and KZ106 FM, and we did 3 or 4 newscasts per hour.
That's a lot.
It was a lot, and the boss was adamant that you wouldn't repeat copy.
So you had to have fresh copy.
Freshen the copy for each newscast, and that's a lot of writing. And it really taught me a flexibility with language that you don't get if a lot of young folks coming out of school write their story for a day, and they think that that's the only way that story can fit together, but it's not. You can rewrite it over and over and over again and change the emphasis and move things around, add a detail or two that wasn't in the original story, all those kinds of things. And in hindsight, I think radio was a great experience for where my career ended up taking me.
And radio was so much different when you came out of school in that almost every station had a news department and was doing news. And it's hard to find a news radio station anymore, or let me rephrase that, a radio station that employs a news person.
Yeah, that's very true. And in those days here in Chattanooga, WDEF had a full staff of radio anchors and reporters. US 101 did, KZ 106 and WGOW, where I worked, did, WDOD did, and we would compete against each other in the field. You learned where the helpful people were in City Hall or at the county commission who would let you take their telephone apart so you could attach alligator clips to the leads and the mouthpiece and use your tape deck as a device to feed material down the line to the station. And whoever got there first and tied up that telephone, the others were shut out until they were finished, and you would win that competition for being first, which was a lot of fun. And it was very competitive in those days. And that also was an aspect of the job that shaped me.
Yeah.
I'm grateful that I had that experience.
The competitive aspect?
Absolutely. It's a competitive business.
How about the relationship aspect of it? I would imagine with something like that, if you had a better relationship with that person at City Hall than your competitor did, that worked to your advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. I came to tell young folks who worked in my newsroom later when I was manager, a secretary or an administrative assistant will make you or break you. So you've got to win that person, because that person is the gatekeeper to the one that you are likely going to want to interview. And once you win their trust, you might even get a little sideward glance or a little comment or something that would give you some direction on, where to take an interview or something like that. And that relationship building was critically important in those days.
You and I have had this discussion before. I came up on the sales end and sales and management end. And I think that the core job of a reporter, or maybe not the core job, but some of the aspects of it, of a reporter and a salesperson are the same.
I think so too. Yeah.
You've got to go out and build relationships and be able to, as you said, not just with the primary person, but up and down the line.
That's right. And then the inevitable day will come when somebody you've counted on as a newsmaker will be upset with something that you've reported.
That never happens.
If you're doing your job right, it's going to happen. If you're not that kind of reporter, then maybe you need to ask yourself, is it okay that everybody loves me? I always said, I want the right people to be mad at me for the right reasons. And so how you handle that relationship after that story has come out that made them unhappy, that's a big part of it too. The tendency is to just consider that bridge burned, but you can't do that. You're going to need this person, and frankly, this individual, the government official, elected official, needs you and your audience. And so it's in both your interests to find a way to agree to disagree perhaps and move forward.
Yeah, it's a two-way street.
That's right.
Absolutely. I want to get into more of the specifics of the current state of journalism, but later, broadcast journalism, but a little bit later. How long were you at GOW?
I was there from 1983 to 1990, so 7 years.
7 years, that's a long time.
It was a long time, and that was a critical 7 years for the radio industry. President Reagan, AM radio was in trouble. Audio advantage provided by FM radio really had diminished the value of AM radio properties around the country. And so the FCC, under the Reagan administration's leadership, changed the ownership rules so that one local owner could own several more AM and FM stations. And this is not a secret. There was a time when the company that owned WGOW AM radio, this is years ago in the 80s, literally couldn't give the station away. They tried to give the station to one of the universities for a tax write-off, and the school wouldn't take it. And so with this reorganization, now that injected new life into AM radio, and that sort of end of the industry was saved.
And that's when broadcasting was very regulated. And I'm thinking back to Memphis with WMC radio and WMC TV. At one point, they would have liked to own the newspaper, and you couldn't.
Couldn't do it.
Yeah.
The FCC counted voices, the number of voices in a market, and they didn't want any owner to have dominance in the market, with a few exceptions. WSB in Atlanta was one of the exceptions. WSB was a clear channel station, which means it got license favorability from its very creation because it was part of the emergency broadcast system as a clear channel station. Clear channel stations don't have to reduce their power so much at night.
You're not talking about the former radio station owner, Clear Channel, the company.
No.
You're talking about a definition.
That's right.
Of
a
the
technical
signal.
definition that made them a part of the emergency broadcast system as part of our civil defense plan.
So you could pick up WSB from places you never expected at night.
That's right.
Because it was a clear channel.
And you had asked me before about how I ended up making such a late decision going into this. I do recall as a child laying in the bed with an AM radio at night when I was supposed to be sleeping.
With a flashlight.
And listening to WLS in Chicago and Ackworth, Georgia, and WNO, I believe it is, out of New Orleans.
Maybe KMOX in St. Louis.
The other clear channel stations across the country, and it would just set my imagination.
Yeah.
Really, wow, there's a whole network of these guys out there. And so, yeah, and back to sort of the point about that period in the 80s, the saving of AM radio really happened after the crisis, of course. And I was told that, well, we're going to have to reduce the news department by one or two people. We don't know who it is yet, but
that's a nice feeling.
That. Yeah, I know. It's like
musical chairs. Turn off the music.
Well, I took the hint and
Yeah.
I started looking around, and a gentleman named Bill Wallace was the news director at Channel 3. A friend of mine called me up and said, hey, you really ought to talk to Bill Wallace because he's got an assignment editor position open, and he's got a history of hiring radio guys for that assignment editor position.
Explain what an assignment editor does.
The assignment editor is sort of the bottom level management position in a TV news operation. Typically, they assign reporters and photographers to their stories. Now, depending on their experience level and the way the shop is arranged, they could have broad latitude to do that, meaning nobody else necessarily would be involved in that decision. Or if there was less experience, they would make those assignments as a middleman at the direction of the executive producer or assistant news director, somebody like that. But it's very much a hands-on coverage position. So if you've got 5 or 6 crews in the field, it's the assignment editor's job to know what those crews are working on and where their location is in case there's breaking news, which one of those is the closest crew that you can pull off and send to this, fatal house fire, whatever it is. So it's kind of like a dispatcher.
Yeah.
In those days, there was no digital, so the competition was on the air. And when 5 o'clock rolled around, you looked at what you had covered in the day, and you looked at what your competitors covered in the day, and it was often very easy to declare one station or the other the winner in coverage that day. Now, there are a lot of other ways to win as well, but for somebody who did have a competitive desire like I did, it was fun to be able to engage that way and feel like I had won most of the time. So
GOW's having to make changes. You get wind of this opportunity at WRCB. You meet with Bill Wallace, and you go work for WRCB.
And long story short, that's the way that happened. And I came in. Bill was a new news director. It was not his first news director gig, but it was his first news director's gig in Chattanooga. Was promoted from within at Channel 3. And I think I probably was his first hire, and stayed there for 4 years and got nice and comfortable in that position. And
what years were those?
That would have been 1990 through about 94.
Any story of note that you think back on?
Oh, my goodness. As far as big news stories, yeah, there was shortly after I got there, I think most of your listeners will remember this. There was a thick fog that settled in over I-75 between Cleveland and Athens in the Calhoun area. Mm-hmm. And that fog was so dense that you could barely see 3 feet in front of your car. And the result of that was a pileup of 75 or 80 cars with multiple deaths, tractor trailers, and just unbelievable carnage along the interstate there. And that one was a severe test, considering I was, relatively new on the assignment desk, and a huge story that was nationwide.
Well, it was a good, 40 miles away from where you were located, too.
That's right, and it's still in our coverage area. And so everybody responded. The national news did pick this up. And interestingly, several years later, when I was at Channel 9 instead of Channel 3, it happened again in Costa County. And very similar circumstances with also a huge tragedy with lots of death and destruction. So there was that. There was, I think I got this right, I believe Hamilton Place Mall opened when I was still in radio.
Because it was open.
Late 80s?
Yeah, it was. I think it opened in 87 because I got married here in actually Cleveland, and we stayed in Chattanooga over Thanksgiving weekend. And it was raining cats and dogs, and the mall just opened. And I was late for my own wedding thanks to that.
Yeah, people who were not here before take for granted Hamilton Place development.
Yeah.
But that truly transformed this community. I remember attending the press conference and looking at the drawings and thinking about where it was going to go. And my initial uninformed opinion was, why are they putting it way out there?
Yeah.
That's the middle of nowhere. Well, it didn't stay middle of nowhere for long. It sort of shifted the development to the eastern side of Hamilton County. Hamilton Place became an enormous economic engine.
Yeah, still is.
Community. Yeah, that's right.
And that whole area.
Yeah.
So you're at Channel 3 as assignment manager. You make a decision to leave, go to Charlotte?
In the course of that time, I became close with the producer who called me every day from NBC News.
Because WRCB was an NBC affiliate.
NBC affiliate station. And in those days, CNN was not brand new, but CNN didn't have the advantage that the other networks had in that they didn't have affiliates all over the country. So NBC, the network, has NBC local stations to dish them news. CNN had no such network, and so they set about building one, and that was a big threat to ABC, CBS, and NBC. They would play nice with assignment editors like me and make their services available either free or at a very low cost, and they built a network or syndication, really, not so much a network, in that way. And NBC and the others created a division to fight back against that. In other words, to be more mindful of the needs of the local affiliates. Prior to that, it was pretty much a one-way street. You send us and thank you very much and don't ask us for anything. But that changed. And I went to work for a part of NBC that called NBC News Channel in Charlotte that was servicing local stations. They were providing national news and regional news content for local stations. That's how if the president were to come to Nashville and speak, and you want that audio and video for your Chattanooga newscast, then you would work through your affiliate services division, in our case, NBC News Channel, and you would get that video that way. Again, that's in that day. These days, you just watch it live.
Yeah.
You cherry pick it live, but in those days, it was more likely a tape feed. So did that for 4 years through the mid-'90s and had another ridiculously positive set of circumstances that allowed me to cover some of the biggest stories of the day nationally, and grateful for that time. I called myself a news tourist.
Well, and I'm thinking about when we first met, we had to go to, I guess, West Palm Beach for a company trip. We're on an airplane, and you're telling me about your Charlotte days, and we're flying over the Everglades, and you're telling me about one of the big stories you covered. about the plane that didn't make it over the Everglades as we're on an airplane.
Yeah, it was a value jet plane.
Yeah,
value
that's what it
jet
was.
doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
But the flight took off out of Miami, and in the cargo hold was a collection of oxygen tanks. And oxygen tanks, I think they were medical oxygen supply tanks, and they are sensitive to pressure. And so as the plane gained altitude, the tanks started exploding and caused a fire and rupture in the belly of the airplane, and it crashed into the Everglades. And the thing about the Glades is, for those who haven't been there, it's mile after mile of nothing.
Yeah.
It's water and low vegetation and
gators.
Very few roads, and gators and crocodiles. And unfortunately, that became part of the story. But had a new girlfriend, and we were at my mother's house for Mother's Day. I had driven over from Charlotte, and Donna had come down from Chattanooga, and it was her first chance to meet my family. And we had just gotten there, and my pager went off. Call the newsroom immediately. So in those days, there was no text messaging. It was there was text messaging, but it was through pagers.
Yeah.
And I called in, and right off the top, I was asked, how quickly can you be at the Atlanta airport? And I said, well, pretty quickly. I'm in Atlanta. Oh, great. Head that way. Yeah, there's been a plane crash. We'll call you with more information. So I had to leave Donna there with my family and take off to Atlanta. Didn't have any clothes.
Baptism by fire for Donna.
That's right. And I think she hung around a polite amount of time, and then she headed back to Chattanooga, which is what I would have done too, probably. Have flip-flops and shorts and a T-shirt on, and that's all I had with me when I showed up at the Atlanta airport. And the rest of the stuff I picked up, just living stuff like shirts and real shoes I bought in Miami. And then we headed out to the Glades, and we spent about a week in the Everglades as they searched for the wreckage and finally found it. And it was a terrible tragedy. There were no survivors from this. And they finally found the wreckage when they spotted from the air an oily spot, an oily sheen on the surface of the water. I don't remember how long, but it took 2 or 3 days before they found the wreckage. Covering the story was brutal. It was very hot and bugs and intense sunshine, and there was no electricity, so we had to bring in generators. It was tough circumstances. We took a box truck, a moving style van, and that became our office. You just throw that roll down door up, and
sounds pleasant.
It was tough. We had satellite phones that we used to get out of there, where it's a suitcase, briefcase size phone, and you raise the back of it up and point it at the satellite, and now you've got telephone service.
When you say covering the story, just for clarification, you weren't reporting it yourself. You were field producing and making everything happen for the reporter who was and the photographer?
Yes, my title was field producer. And actually at that time, we didn't have any field producers. My title was producer, but I was selected to go into the field as part of the team. It wasn't just me. There was a sizable team because we were doing 24-hour coverage there. So you need a producer for every 8 or 10 hour shift.
Yeah.
And I had the morning shift, which means you work all night and you do morning news from the Everglades. And, we had a satellite truck that we were working from that was patched together with duct tape and baling wire. Really shouldn't have been using it. It barely worked. And every time the air conditioner would cycle on in the truck, it would knock us off the satellite, knock our signal off the satellite. And we couldn't get the truck operator to believe us when we told him, we think this is what the problem is. He liked having air conditioning and he didn't want to sit in that truck without air conditioning. So he was having trouble believing it. But we finally told him, you've got to turn the air conditioning off. And we didn't have any more trouble after that. But it was pretty extreme conditions, probably the toughest assignment I drew while I was.
Is an assignment like that what made you say, I want to go back to the local level and stop traveling the country?
At that time, it didn't.
No.
For those who really don't know, and I guess that's most everybody, a field producer is one of the dream jobs in TV news. You do, especially when you're young and you don't have family considerations. It's a great way to see the country and collect experiences. And I was fortunate enough to be able to do that for those 4 years and cover the biggest stories of the day and gain that experience. I did eventually get to the place where I looked around at everybody else who was in roles similar to that and the lifestyle that they were leading. They'd missed a lot of birthdays and they've missed a lot of holidays and they were not close to their families anymore. And the friends that they had tended to be other field people and that kind of thing. And I really wasn't put together that way. And so I started thinking, yeah, this is a lot of fun, but and very rewarding. And I also felt like I was doing important work. But that young lady that I had to leave at my mom's house on Mother's Day kept coming back in my memory, and we had stayed in touch. And before long, I was actively looking for a way to return to Chattanooga so that Donna and I could be closer together. And because that kind of lifestyle was not something that I saw myself doing 10, 15 years in.
So how'd you get back?
I was standing in a vacant parking lot across from what had been the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. Folks will remember that name because it was the federal building that was obliterated by Timothy McVeigh using a truck bomb in one of the worst cases, maybe the worst case of domestic terrorism in this country's history. And I was covering not the event, but the trial. The trial was in Denver because the federal districts out west are vast. And so even though the crime had occurred in Oklahoma City, the trial was in Denver. And I was in Oklahoma City for the reaction to the verdict. And the verdict had come in that afternoon, and we were scrambling to get it on the air. And I got a phone call, and it was a friend in Chattanooga who knew that I was looking for a way to return. And she told me about a position at Channel 9 that I would have been well qualified for. And I said, thank you very much. I got to go. And got returned to work and got that story on the end. Then applied for the assignments manager position at News Channel 9 and ended up winning that position and coming back to Chattanooga.
What year was that?
I think it was 97.
So you get back to Chattanooga, you're in TV news, and one of the curious things I had as we were talking is your first love radio or TV?
I loved them both for different reasons. My first love was radio. At TV, it's kind of the difference between tennis and basketball. You know, with tennis, you're out there on the court and it's you. And whether you win or lose, it's you. Unless you're playing doubles. But for the most part, it's much more of a individual kind of experience. And television is much more of a team sport. I had said basketball, but really it's more like football because the team is pretty big. And
everyone's got a specific role too.
That's right. And I'd experienced that at Channel 3 and sort of knew my place in the team and then experienced it again at NBC and then became comfortable with being a part of a team. You know, both those positions would involve leadership, but it's sort of a different emphasis in the leadership when you're leading a team rather than sort of leading yourself. And I really, especially when you came over as the general manager at Channel 9, really began to put a lot of emphasis on learning to be a manager and a leader. And as you'll remember, we drew a pretty sharp distinction between the two. There are managers and there are leaders. And one is expansive and the other is more limited in its scope. Both functions are critically important. The manager is the small view, of course, but leadership goes beyond that and really is about taking personal responsibility for the success of the team. I would say.
You were pretty proactive in doing things on your own to build your leadership knowledge. Can you talk about some of those things?
Sure. There may be other enterprises, but certainly broadcast news, you don't get promoted because you're a great leader or because you're a great manager. You get promoted because you showed some proficiency at the job you were in, and then you go to the next level, and it's sort of up to you to learn, how to be a manager and what fairness looks like and what future thinking looks like, planning and that kind of thing. And I had done it sort of my way, and then when you came along, I continued that. But we also got a lot of great opportunities. Freedom Communications, who we worked for at the time, was very good at giving us training opportunities that we could then take back to our teams and pass along, and really got an awful lot out of that. But yeah, I think that sums it up.
So you get to News Channel 9, legacy station. You got the big four anchors, Bob Johnson, Mary Ellen Locher, Neil Pascal, Daryl Patterson. It was really the heyday of television.
It really was. And there was an experienced team across town at Channel 3, and David Carroll and Cindy Sexton and Paul Barris and
Bill Markham.
Bill Markham, that's right. And it was a slugfest in those days as far as the competition goes. 3 had a pretty clear identity. We had a pretty clear identity. And, competition was tough. So as it happens, shortly after I arrived and you arrived, our frontline team began to change, not through any planning or action on our part. Just some tragic things began to happen. Everyone who's been in Chattanooga for any length of time knows the Mary Ellen Locher story. She passed away of recurring breast cancer, and it was a real heartbreaking situation. She fought for years against cancer and thought she had it whipped, and then it came back, and her loss was devastating. And then Neil Pascal got into some legal trouble and had to say goodbye because of that. And these were 2 key individuals toward News Channel 9's success, and those were difficult days.
That's when you go with what you were dealt,
Pretty much. And what I learned through that, beyond the relationship parts, we were people in the newsroom were looking to leadership as a way to understand these things. That's the way it always works. When big developments happen, people who have bosses that they're close to seek a sort of a way to come to terms with what's happened. And we took that on, and I won't say that I did a great job at that, but I certainly recognized that was my role and embraced that. And I believe you did too. And you were a strength to me and to lots of other folks too.
I appreciate you saying that. And that's part of leadership. But I think also the fact that you build a strong team allows the team to come together. And building that strong team is a lot of factors: communication and giving people opportunities and having their back. That, you lose your main anchor and you lose your popular weather person. A lot of leaders would go, "Ooh, we're really screwed." Or you turn to your team and say, "Okay, it's time for someone else to step up."
Well, that's right, and they did step up.
Yep, exactly.
And one of the things that I took away from that a year or 2 later was the strength of the News Channel 9 brand in the market. It was bigger than any 1 or 2 people, and the audience was always very gracious to us. They stayed with us through all kinds of changes, and that was a source of confidence, really, for me, that we can make bold moves, we can withstand hardship, and still have a strong place in the hearts and the minds of the audience. So, we had depth, and there were people available who could step into these roles, and they did. And David Glenn got the chance to come back to Chattanooga as the chief meteorologist at Channel 9 through that, and he's still there doing a great job. And it was difficult but rewarding, period.
Simultaneously, during all this personnel change and everything else, the industry's changing too.
Absolutely.
And can you talk a little bit about that evolution of, and you said it earlier, of competing against your primary competitor on your coverage at 5 p.m. because it was only the 5 or 6 o'clock news that someone was getting their information, to the internet and the advent of everything must go now, and how you compete. How did that change the newsroom?
Oh, goodness. In the digital environment, which this is not even new anymore. It still feels a little bit new to me, but this has been the rule now for years. Live is much more important. So any event of any kind of substance where television is concerned, you want to see it live. And I don't mean just see it live on television. You want to see it live on Facebook. You want to see it live on the website. You want to see it live on Twitter, which is now X. And that is a logistical change in the way you cover news. You don't send a reporter and a photographer out to cover a story. You send a reporter, a photographer, and a live unit out. And live stopped being a big truck with a satellite dish that you raised, and you located the satellite in the sky and you set up a signal, and maybe that takes 15 minutes. Live is a backpack that the photog carries on his or her back, that you just plug a camera in, and it uses cellular technology to stitch together a broadcast signal and send it back to the newsroom and then out through these distribution points. So the first change was this change in logistics and how we cover a story and the tools we use and that kind of thing. With social media, the next thing that comes to mind is we had instant feedback. Prior to social media, somebody could have an opinion about a story that we ran, and they could call us up and tell us that, but that's a very linear thing. You get off that one call, and maybe you get another call, and then another call, and by now you figured out, well, we really hit a home run, or we really touched a nerve, with our coverage on this thing. But it was very one at a time. But with social media, a story, your coverage of a story could blow up. And it gave a platform to bad actors who wanted to cause mischief in your newsroom, who could incite social media to come after you. And that was a real challenge in the beginning, knowing, how do we respond to this? It did, I will say that feature of the change, I believe, caused all newsrooms to be more introspective about what it is that we did. I remember back in the 70s, there was a Pennsylvania or New Jersey, I think it was a New Jersey local official who got in some legal trouble, and he called a news conference and he took his own life live in the news conference. And one TV station carried that live. And they were broadly criticized for having done that. And they just flatly said, it's news, we cover the news, and we saw no reason not to cover that live. And I can tell you from my experience now, that would never happen now.
Yeah.
Well, let me back that up a little bit. There could be some rogue players who had access to a live feed of that would put it out on the internet, but any reputable news organization would not look at that way. There's more of a sensitivity to audience standards for violence, particularly that would.
But because of the internet and the availability that digital makes to these platforms, a lot of people don't have standards, and it's not necessarily an organization. Really, anyone with an iPhone camera can stream it live.
That's exactly right. And
so you lose the gatekeeper.
You lose the gatekeeper. You have to become your own gatekeeper. And I'm not sure, as a community, a national community, we do a very good job at that. We put ourselves in a bubble, and we protect ourselves very often, or the algorithms protect us very often from opinions, thoughts that run contrary to what we already believe. And that's where the polarization we see in politics and in society generally. in my mind, that explains almost 100% of that. Back in the day when there were 3 network newscasts in the evening at 6:30, I'm going back to the 70s now, there was more of a unified understanding of what's important. But now with this fragmentation that we're talking about, you can find anything you want and a piece of spectrum of that totality. You can stay in that small spectrum and not expose yourself to anything else. And that's how we have, those of us who've had the opportunity to speak to somebody who has different political beliefs than we do, you listen to them and it's like, where did you hear that? What are you talking about? I don't even know, unless you intentionally expose yourself to what other people are saying, other outlets are saying that differ from your beliefs. It's hard to even have a common language.
You said something about the 3 national newscasts and kind of a unified understanding of what's important. Can the counter argument be made that, well, that's what the problem is? They were holding all this other news and information away from us, and it was all planned.
I think as Americans, maybe everybody else too, but as Americans, we have a hard time with the concept of many things being true at once. What you said is absolutely true. It was too narrow. It was very much too narrow. It really didn't take the heartland into account at all. What mattered was Washington, New York, the Beltway, and a little bit of the West Coast. And only the most extreme stuff from the heartland even got reported. And even in the Beltway, there was a day when pollsters would do polls and what would come back would be that, well, there's not much difference between Democrats and Republicans. I don't think anybody would say that today.
There's a little bit. No.
Yeah. So it was too narrow. And it's not like the internet was created to address that problem. The internet just happened.
Yeah.
And then what followed was this fragmentation that has gotten us to where we are today.
Yeah. And we could do a whole other podcast and talk about the state of journalism. This is really about your career. And I got us off on a little bit of a tangent. Talk a little bit about, going from assignment manager to news director, what that meant to you in terms of how you had to change your leadership. Or did you?
I absolutely did. The assignment manager primarily is concerned with bringing the news into the building. Now, this is pre-digital, of course, but beyond that, the news director is concerned with that plus everything else. The big difference is the hiring of the frontline team. Local stations are known in their markets by the most prominent journalists that are on the air. And by that, I'm talking about the anchors. And so assembling that team and, maintaining sort of a consistency in that function is really important. The news director also sets sort of the broad parameters of the coverage. Are we going to be this kind of newsroom, or are we going to be more of this kind of newsroom? And that sort of speaks to your brand statement, which is a lot of minutia that you probably don't want to go into. But the news director is involved at that level, and then the marketing of the news products. The news director works in conjunction with other department heads to do that. And in fact, the news director works with the engineering department, the sales department, marketing, everybody as a member of the station's leadership team. And so it's a much broader job. And I found it challenging in the beginning, but I think sort of settled into a comfortable place, and we worked it out.
Over the course of your career, you did radio, you did reporting, you did field producing, management in a newsroom. What was your favorite?
I really loved the writing. And so just for the simple joy of it all, I would say the radio reporting and writing was probably my favorite.
You ever think radio will be back to what it was?
Yes. We may not call it radio. We may call it podcasting.
There you go. Yeah.
So, yeah, radio is alive and well. And
it's just a different platform.
It's just a different platform. It's morphed a little bit. I listen to a lot of NPR, and you can tell that they take a lot of joy in their reporting. There's a real craft there.
Well, one thing I hope podcasting doesn't do is get overwhelmed with commercials, even though I always come up through the sales side, which is a great reminder that before we get to the last question, I want to remind our listeners who makes all of this possible, and that's the Tennessee Valley Authority, and I want to thank them for sponsoring my Morning Cup. Follow TVA on social media to learn more about its multifaceted mission of service, and visit tva.com/do-good-here to explore exciting TVA career opportunities. How'd you like that segue?
Perfect.
I do have one last question for you. What would you tell your 25-year-old self is important for a happy life?
Balance.
Explain that.
I'm a pretty obsessive person when I get going.
I never noticed that.
You never notice that, right? I sort of get my teeth in something and I can make that 100% of everything for a while. And then a lot of times I'm off of that and I'm on to something else. But I think a healthier way to approach life is to spread yourself out more in interests and activities and not be so single-mindedly focused on one thing.
What do you say to the argument from a 25-year-old who says, well, you've got to hyper-focus on what you want your career to be to get going? It's easy to say when you're 60.
Again, that's one of those many things are true at once. That is true. That is absolutely true. But even so, rather than give it 100%, maybe you give it 60%. And you save that 40 for something else to round yourself out. In the long run, you want to be a well-rounded person. And in the short run, just sort of being mindful of what you put your energy into is how you get there.
Yeah, good point. I enjoyed the conversation. We need to do this again because we got a lot more to talk about.
Well, thank you, Mike. I've enjoyed it myself and really appreciate your friendship too.
I do too. Good to see you, Tom. Thanks for listening to My Morning Cup, a podcast by Costa Media Advisors. If you like this episode, please share it with a friend. I release a new episode each week, so be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts.